right, guys, welcome to part 4 of the Book of Mormon versus the Bible. If you're Mormon and you're turning into this the first time, you're probably already annoyed a little bit by the title. Let me challenge you with this. Joseph Smith made the claim that the Book of Mormon is the most accurate book of all books in history. If that's true, we should really be able to evaluate it, and that's essentially all I'm doing. I'm looking at the Bible, I'm seeing the reasons why we know that the Bible is trustworthy and reliable and correct, and seeing if the Book of Mormon really compares and adds up just as well as the Bible. If not, it really should be better, according to Joseph Smith's claim. So in this video, we're talking about the ways through historians from the same time period as the Bible and archaeological evidence from that same time period shows us that the Bible is reliable. In our previous videos, we've talked about a lot of other reasons why we can trust the Bible as being reliable. In our next videos, we'll start getting into whether or not the Book of Mormon adds up in the same sort of way. I'm going to do a little bit more research before I jump into that because I do want to give it a fair shake, and I don't want to just give, here are my evidences against the Book of Mormon without really researching it well. So there's probably going to be a pause before I get to that part in the series, and hopefully for those of you that are Mormon and watching this video, you understand that my heart is genuine to look at that honestly. If there's certain sources you think I need to look at, please send them my way so that I can look at those and hopefully really produce good material for when I produce the next videos. Thanks a lot. So we're going to jump straight into it. There's a lot of different evidences that we could look at for the reasons why we can trust the Bible as being reliable. We talked about some of those last week or in the last video. But now what we're going to get into is some of the other writings from the same time period as the New Testament. We could talk about the Old Testament. There's a lot of other things with that as well, but I wanted to just focus on the New Testament. There's so much information in all of this with archaeological evidence, with other writings from the same time period when it comes to giving evidence that the Bible is reliable, that we just don't have time to get into all of that. So I'm just focusing on the New Testament. What we're first going to look at then is just the different sources from that same time period that confirm some of the things that the Bible says. So one source, for instance, that we have is Tacitus. And Tacitus is a Roman historian, and he confirms that Jesus died under Pontius Pilate. So, of course, that's what the Bible says. Now we have a non-Christian source confirming that's actually what happened. Suetonius, he's the chief secretary of Emperor Hadrian and refers to the arguments among the Jews about Jesus' identity. And so this is obviously another evidence because when you understand in that time period, Christians would actually be seen as a Jewish sect. So when Suetonius writes and says that the Jews had disagreement about who Jesus was, it totally makes sense and lines up with what we know from Scripture because the Jews rejected, a lot of the Jews rejected, and especially the Jewish leaders rejected Jesus as the Messiah. Then we also have Josephus. Now Josephus is important for many reasons. First of all, he's another historian. And then second of all, he's writing for the Romans and he's Jewish. So if he's writing and he's confirming some of the facts that we have in the New Testament, then we know it must be true because he's, as a Roman or as someone writing for the Romans, he's not going to want to confirm anything that puts Jesus in a good light or puts him as a king or anything like that. As a Jewish person, he's also not going to want to confirm that for the same reason we just talked about with Suetonius. Suetonius pointed out that there's disagreement on who Jesus was, that Jewish leaders say that Jesus wasn't the Messiah. Josephus then is going to want to confirm that. So if he says anything that seems to point to, or at least acknowledge that some people believed that Jesus was the Messiah, then that's good reason to trust the Bible's reliable. What Josephus writes actually confirms to us not only that, but also that the canon that we have, what we talked about in the last video, the Old Testament canon is what was reliable, is what the Jewish leaders believed in that time. He also confirms that James is Jesus's brother. He also talks about the martyrdom of John the Baptist and who John the Baptist was martyred by. He also gives this quote, and this is an interesting thing. There's two different quotes that are a little bit disputed whether or not Josephus wrote all of it. And the first one I'm actually just going to skip over because that's the one that most people will contend a little bit. They'll say, I don't know if he really said that, because basically it's going to say something along the lines of, at that time there was a man named Jesus, if it's worthy to call him a man, as if to imply he's the Messiah. And of course, if he's Jewish, it seems odd that he would be confirming that. And so a lot of people would say that little part, if it be worthy to call him a man, is something that was put into the text later. But what we have is other texts. We have an Arabic translation, and that translation, there's nothing in it that we have any question that Josephus wrote that. And so we're going to look at just that text, and this is what he says in that text. At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and his learning outstanding, and many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and die, and those who had become his disciples did not abandon their discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them after 3 days, and that he was alive accordingly. He was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. And so all of that information is things that we have a Jewish Roman historian confirming that the Bible was accurate in what it recorded. We also have Thallus, who's a historian, and he actually records that there was an eclipse. That's the way they understood the darkening of the sun that we see that happened when Jesus was crucified. Pliny the Younger, he's a Roman officer and administrator. He admits that the Jewish sect, the Christians that are following Jesus, worshipped Jesus as God. And he's writing in the early 2nd century, so we know that this isn't something that was hundreds of years later. The idea of Jesus coming to be worshipped was proclaimed later. It's believed from the very get-go. Then we also have the Jewish Talmud. Now again, this is unique because now we have a Jewish text. The Jewish Talmud is essentially a commentary of the Old Testament by Jewish rabbis. And so we have another source here that shouldn't confirm anything that the New Testament is proclaiming, that shouldn't want to confirm Jesus as the Messiah or proclaim the Messiah in any sort or form. And the Jewish Talmud confirms that Jesus lived and that he was sentenced to death on a cross by the Jewish people. Lucian is a 2nd century satirist. He is the South Park of the 2nd century. And he admits that Jesus was again worshipped as God. And then we also have Marabar Serapion, and he confirmed as a Stoic philosopher that the Jews killed Jesus. So what do we have in total? What we have is all of these historians, all of these writings from the same time period as the New Testament, confirming so much of the writing of the New Testament as being historically accurate. So in summation, what we could say is we know from non-Christian sources, we know these facts. And some of these facts that I'm going to share aren't ones that I gave you sources for, but they're in other sources. I'm giving you guys the highlights. There's a lot more sources that we could talk about and get in depth, but I'm trying to give you the quick ones that are probably the most compelling. So you have Jesus of Nazareth is confirmed by non-Christian sources, that he lived a virtuous life, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar at Passover time, and was considered a Jewish king. He was believed to have rose from the dead in 3 days. His enemies attest that he performed miracles or acts of sorcery, as those sources would actually call it, and that the small band of disciples grew and spread as far as Rome. Those disciples then denied polytheism, which is continuing in the Jewish tradition. They denied polytheism, but they start worshiping a man. They start worshiping Jesus as God. This is really significant because Jews would never dream to say that a man is God. Even to this day, that's part of the reason so many Jews are offended by the gospel. The idea to say that a man is God is offensive to the whole Jewish religion. And so that we have all of a sudden this sect of Judaism that's really, again, what Christianity should be viewed as, suddenly confirming and saying not only is it possible, it did happen, and this man Jesus is in fact God, and we're worshiping him as such. And then lastly, the other thing that we have as a fact from non-Christian sources is that the Messiah, Jesus being the Messiah, was rejected by the Jewish leaders at the time. So all of this to say, we have all of these different sources from the same time period or very close to the writing of the New Testament, confirming so much of the facts that we have of the New Testament. Now, the other thing that gets even more interesting is some of the archaeological facts that we have that prove that the New Testament is reliable. In fact, Nelson Gluck, he's a very famous historian, actually says that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted any biblical reference. Anything. So again, we're bringing all of this up just to say, hey, the Book of Mormon is claiming that it's the most correct book of any book of history. Well, this is what it's got to measure up against. So one of the first things we might look at is talking about the Old Testament. And there's lots of different things we could look at with this, but one of the most compelling ones that I've found, and you can find a lot more of these details from a documentary called Patterns of Evidence, Exodus. And it's giving a ton of different reasons and ways that we know that the Exodus actually happened. And one of the most compelling things in that is what we know about Jericho. So one of the first things we need to clarify when we're talking about archaeological discoveries, one of the biggest things and the hardest things for archaeologists to do, even today, is to date certain things that they find to the right time period that they're supposed to be placed in. So Jericho, for the longest time, was believed to be a fable, at least from our archaeological standard. We had no evidence that any sort of attack like that happened in what we now know is Jericho. But then with some shifting and understanding that some of the pottery was probably dated incorrectly and that some pottery should have dated to another time period, we're able to shift the biblical timeline to fit more up with what the traditional view of the archaeological timeline should be, and things started to fit in extremely well. So if you recall with the story of Jericho, they're called to come in and take over this city, and they're walking around it 7 times, and on the 7th day, they walk around it 7 times once more. 7 times for 7 days, and then the 7th day, 7 times in that one day. And then they blow their trumpets, the walls fall down, they charge inside, and as they're commanded by God, they do not plunder the city, but they burn it to the ground. And then they leave. Also, Rahab, who had helped some of the Jewish spies to get out of the city after they had spied on the city to decide whether to attack or not, her home was built into the wall, which was a very traditional way of doing things. Why build 4 walls when you could just use the wall of the city as part of your wall and build from there? Less material, less work. Win-win. And so with that idea, when the walls fall, we know that God promised that Rahab and anyone in her household would be protected, which means that part of the wall wouldn't fall down. And so what we should expect then is a city that was prepared for a siege because they knew the Jewish people were coming. It should be around the time of harvest because that's what the Bible tells us, is that it was around time of harvest. So they should have brought in their harvest, preparing for a siege, because a siege in that time period could last for months, sometimes years. And so you bring in all your grain because the last thing you want is to reach a point where you just have no food and you have to surrender because there's no way to survive otherwise. And so they should bring in their food. They shouldn't have much time, though, to consume that food, nor do they run away with that food because the walls fall down and the Jewish people come in and burn the city to ground and kill everyone except Rahab and her family. So we should expect the walls down, the city burned, grain storage is high, except for one section of the wall remains. And when historians have dug up the city of Jericho from that shift in the timeline to fit it in line with what the Bible says, what we see is we see a city that's strongly fortified, has extremely big and strong walls. We see that the city was attacked after the time of harvest because there's a lot of grain storage there. we see that the inhabitants had no chance to flee with their grain storages or consume them. So the siege didn't last very long, and they weren't able to escape. We see that the siege was short because of that. We see that the walls were leveled except for one section where Rahab's home would have been. And then we see that the city wasn't plundered, which is extremely unusual. When you take over a city and you're taking over places, naturally, you've been sieging probably for a long time. This time we know it wasn't, but you're still going to at least take the best goods there. But if you siege for a long time, obviously you really want to plunder everything. So they didn't plunder anything. Plus, with the grain storages being high, what we found is that the grain is burned on the top and the city itself is burned. That lines up so well with the Bible that it's very clear that this is the Jericho that the Bible is talking about. Now, some archaeologists will still say that the old timeline fits, but this is obviously, to me, a point at which you're fitting the timeline and you're just not wanting it to fit with what the Bible is really saying. There's plenty of reasons why we should look at it and understand that that timeline needs to shift and it would fit in line with the biblical timeline. So that's just one example. If you watch that Patterns of Evidence, Exodus, he has another Patterns of Evidence dealing with Moses, and I think maybe one other video coming out soon dealing with some other historical things from the time period or from the Old Testament. You're going to see all sorts of other things. For instance, he talks about a city outside of Egypt during the time of one of the kings, one of the pharaohs. And again, when we shift that to a different pharaoh than traditionally people have thought was the pharaoh that Joseph would have been under, then it fits in line with this pharaoh that rose to power in a huge way. He rises to power in a huge way because all of a sudden everything's consolidated, which makes sense. If there's a famine and Joseph had warned them of the famine, told the pharaoh to bring all the grain storages together so everyone else will come and give him money for the grain he's stored up, then he's going to consolidate power in a huge way. We see that outside of this kingdom of Egypt at the time, on the very edge, is this one city that has a very similar structures to the cities that would be in Ur, which Abraham is coming from Ur. And so the cities that they would build as the Israelites would have a very similar structure to that. Plus, we see a palace within that city that's built in the Egyptian style. Kind of odd, it's on the outskirts of town. And there's 12 pillars like 12 sons and 12 tribes. And inside that palace, or on the outside of that palace, then there's 12 graves, and only one of them is built in the Egyptian style. And inside of that tomb is a tomb, again, built in the Egyptian style, with a statue. And that statue, that man is painted in such a way that they have characteristics, again, of the people of the land of Ur. Both their clothing and both the way that their makeup was done. And on top of that, they also saw that there's a coat painted on him, a coat that was very colorful. And so all of these are things that are evidence that the Bible is very clearly historically accurate. Now, other archaeological things that we could look at, we could also look at Luke. Luke, for instance, by many historians, is considered a historian of the best rank. One historian actually says that Luke is a historian of first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, this author should be placed along the greatest historians. This is by Sir Arthur Ramsay, and he is one of the most prolific archaeologists of that area and time period. Not only that, what's interesting to know is to know Sir Arthur Ramsay was actually a skeptic, and he actually sought out to try to show why the Bible was inaccurate. But as he did his research and started to see all of the different things that lined up, especially with Luke's writing, to history, he was convinced that not only was this reliable, it was actually one of the best historical pieces from the time period. He calls the Book of Luke and the Book of Acts one of the best historical writings of the entire time period. What we see is Luke confirms all of these sort of facts, things like the wind direction off a certain island on a certain day that is confirmed by other Roman historians or Roman sources of the time period. You're not going to get the wind direction right unless you were there and you wrote it down correctly. And then we also see that he writes about over 32 different countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands without error. In fact, there's times where different names for leaders in the government, praetorians or different leaders of the government, are questioned by historians. And some would say that Luke got maybe this one right, and then he got this one wrong. And what we found is some of those times, it was turned out that the historian that was examining it had less information clearly than Luke did, because he might talk about there's a praetoriate in one area, and the historians at that knowledge, what we knew at that time, we said that they didn't use that title for government at that time period. But then more archaeological discoveries were made, and turns out Luke was right. In fact, this is something that ends up being a typical thing. The Pool of Bethsaida is another one that a lot of historians read in the Gospels and decided this doesn't exist. We've scoured a lot of Israel, we found a lot of the city of Jerusalem, and we have no evidence of the Pool of Bethesda, and therefore the Bible isn't historically reliable. Well, give it a few years, turns out we found it. And we found an inscription saying Pool of Bethesda. In fact, we've also found things like the Pilate inscription. And the Pilate inscription writes Tiberian, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, confirming exactly the title that we know that the New Testament says that Pontius Pilate had. Then we also have the Tel Dan description. This is another example where historians at one point said, we can't trust the Bible because we have no evidence that King David ever even had a dynasty whatsoever. Yet, then we found this inscription, the Tel Dan inscription that says, House of David, King of Israel. And so all of these different times that historians might say, we have no evidence to line up with that. And then it turns out, well, we really did. One of the more interesting ones that I came across was the idea that the censuses were made that forced people to go back to their homeland. Well, it turns out we actually have some historical writings from that time period that talk about the Roman censuses and how some of them, in fact, one writing to an area in Egypt says that in order to perform this census, you need to head to your home if for any reason you're not home currently. So all of these sort of things, these questions that a lot of times people might bring up and say the Bible is historically inaccurate, they don't have a lot of ground to stand on. Unless you can bring up something that ultimately confirms that the Bible is historically inaccurate with something, not just that we don't have archaeological evidence of something, then you haven't really disproven the Bible. And a lot of historians would just simply say, we have no archaeological facts that ever refute anything from the New Testament. So, with all of this in mind, what we're looking at is we're saying the Bible is extremely reliable. Now we're going to start getting into, in these next videos, we're going to talk about the Book of Mormon and how well does it line up with the Bible as far as how reliable it is. We're going to talk about how we got the Book of Mormon, comparing it to the Bible. Do we have reasons to trust that it hasn't been changed over the years? It's a lot less time than the Bible has had, but we've talked about in videos previous how we know the Bible hasn't been changed over the years. Do we have reasons to think that the person that wrote it down originally is a reliable source? Did they give things that would make them look foolish or somehow dumb? And in that sense, it gives you clout to know you're writing down what actually happened because the principle of embarrassment. Do we have reasons to trust the text? And then ultimately, do we have archaeological or historical sources that back up the claims that the book is making? These are all the things that the Book of Mormon is going to have to do if it really is more correct than the Bible. Now, I'm going to let you know that I'm going to be taking a little pause before I jump into this. I'm going to take some time to try to do some more research because I do want to give this a fair shake. I don't want to just go in and say all of the reasons that we don't trust the Book of Mormon. I want to actually see what are the arguments that Mormons make that the Book of Mormon is just as reliable, or in fact, what they need to do to say it's more reliable than the Bible. So I've got a lot of research to do, and it might be a little bit before I really get back to finishing up this series. But I hope you'll keep tuning in. I'll be making other shorter videos in the meantime, week to week. So I hope you enjoyed the content, and we'll catch you again next week. Hey guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did, please give it a like and a subscribe. Also think about supporting this ministry financially. Your support allows me to create more content in the future that's hopefully more of a resource to others and to yourself. If you want to do that, there's a link in the description that will take you to my Ratio Christi page, and you can set up a donation there. Thanks a lot.